We live in an era of nostalgia. No matter what happens in our lives, if we go for a rough patch, we lose a loved one, or just feel overwhelmed by the sheer weight of the world, you always have something to turn to that can give you that simple fix, transporting you from the present to a time where everything felt so much simpler. For some, that's in the form of food, or a place, or a song that rekindles memories you thought long dead. For me though, it takes its form in visual media. Star Wars, Indiana Jones, Spider-Man, pretty much anything you could imagine I at one point or another got exposed to, sparking my imagination and leaving a permanent imprint on my memory and who I am as a person. And what sticks with me more than anything in these movies isn't the cool action, iconography, or spectacle, oh no. What sticks with me is the characters. What remains with me is the legacy and ideas they personify. And as much as I'd like that legacy and those ideas to be frozen in time until I decide to revisit them, Hollywood has other plans. If you're someone with eyes, ears, a brain, a soul, and access to a cinema in the last decade, you've watched several parts of your past be dug out of the dirt and put onto the screen. Star Wars, here's a lot of it, like an annoying amount of it. Spider-Man, you got it. Indiana Jones, you betcha. Harrison Ford crashes back onto the big screen with another installment pushing just how far an 81-year-old man will go to tie up loose ends.
Get back, you black son of a...
Even things you never wanted to come back is here again now in all its apathy and resignation. What on paper sounds like a constant drip of that good stuff ends up all having something in common. When we see these icons of our childhood come back for the first time in years or decades, chances are we get one of two things. They're either broken old men, begging for death and critical of their past, or almost unrecognizable from the character you once knew. Which has led to a lot of outrage, a lot of angry fans disappointed with the portrayal they got after waiting many years to see their favourite guy again. And I'm one of those people too. One of my first videos on this channel was me talking about the Book of Boba Fett, a show that resurrected one of the most enigmatic and iconic Star Wars characters and completely assassinated what he was 30 years prior. No longer a cool space cowboy that walked with confidence, intimidation, and a distinct sound that encapsulated everything he was. Merciless, cutthroat, a mercenary willing to do whatever it took to finish a job. Now he's a goofy fat bald guy preaching the benefits of being a good neighbor, getting his ass handed to him in every single scene and disregarding the very thing he once used to personify. Something I'm sure is not an unfamiliar idea to any of you watching. If you're not upset with Boba Fett, you were probably upset with Luke Skywalker, coming back onto the screen after 30 years only to be a jaded, cynical asshole waiting for death to take him in his little hut. Or it was Kenobi, where a beloved actor returned after a decade, only to come back after selling away his dignity and taking a crash course in how to be a jaded cynic waiting for death to knock on his door. Star Wars alone has several examples you could point to that personify this trope, and even that franchise itself debatedly got the soft reboot, we're gonna bring back old stuff for the member berries and then sell our new toys instead trend started. It's a surefire moneymaker when you slap that familiar thing on a poster and bait people into thinking they'll get that exact same feeling they used to get when things were simpler. Indiana Jones, Terminator, and a whole bunch of other movies and shows that I've definitely seen. This is a trend. This is a practice you see a lot, and while it's easy to sit back here and rant endlessly about the treatment of some of these old characters in the modern day, complaining about how they could have been done better, how they screwed up, what they were, and their overall image, I can't bring myself to slap a simple label on these projects or write them off the same way others have been doing for the past few years. Because yes, while a lot of the reasonings for this trend are rooted in some kind of fact, putting something into absolutes of being inherently bad has never really sat right with me. Corporate cynicism and greed is an undeniable factor. In my Book of Boba video, I made a big point theorizing that his radical character shift was due to some of the writers or producers wanting to undermine what he was to make way for their own shiny new replacement. But the label I dislike being put onto these projects as inherently bad is the idea of these movies, shows, games, or whatever deconstructing the legacy of these characters. Or even if we want to talk more generally, the idea of bringing these characters back as old men, as people who are distinct from how they were 30 or so years ago. Because let's face it, things change, the world's changed, we've changed, and subsequently these characters have changed from what they were. Trends ebb and flow, storytelling sensibilities change. While every story ever told is a variation on something that has its roots at the beginning of human history, what kind of stories you get, how characters are portrayed is something that is constantly changing through the decades, dependent on our history and our culture. When you look at films past with a step taken back, it's easy to observe trends, archetypes, and attitudes that set the tone for what each generation of pop culture is defined by. The 1940s was a decade at war. Patriotism and morale was prioritized in media with very defined good guys and bad guys. The delineation was clear. Values were squeaky clean and consistent. They promoted unity in trying times, staying together and standing back against oppression. Even if someone started out reluctant, in the end they always did the right thing. The 60s were the polar opposite. The Vietnam War was going on. As the years passed by, any notions of clear good and bad that existed during the Second World War was gone. It was controversial, there was a generational and cultural divide, society as a whole was changing rapidly and it wasn't a squeaky clean period. War's cruelty was not disguised, the horrors of what was happening was spread to the public, and concepts of unity and wholesome values that the 1940s promoted were being very heavily tested. Chances in film were given to younger talent, a generation more jaded, counterculture and ready to test the system. We got the rise of the anti-hero, moral greys, your main character wasn't completely honourable, they would be cold-blooded killers, opportunists, or sometimes just straight up horrible people. What was taboo and regulated in the 40s became the norm of the era. The 70s and 80s saw the rise of the blockbuster. The 30-year cycle of nostalgia came into effect and films like Indiana Jones and Star Wars emerged as a homage to what the creators grew up with. Films were gritty and avant-garde still, but there was also fun and adventure, spectacle, a push in technology that allowed stories to be told that could have never existed before. Remember when this video was about legacy characters? I'm sorry class, I really am. The thing I'm trying to illustrate with this little history lesson is that every decade breeds a new attitude, a new era for the industry, and a new batch of creators from a generation different from the last. Entertainment changes constantly. While it's easy to call this a decade without identity, seeing regurgitations of things we know, sequels, reboots, remakes, spin-offs, the rise and fall of pre-existing IPs, my argument is that the last 10 years have been one of deconstruction. It's a whole new world than what it was 30 years ago. Society is different, technology is different, and if there's one thing the younger generation like to do, it's to look back on the old and question it. What is the legacy of what came before? How is it affecting us now? There's an urge to comment on that. We have new media like YouTube and streaming rivaling mainstream entertainment, giving chances to any asshole like me with a Blue Yeti microphone, unsolicited opinions and a dream. While blockbuster filmmaking is falling short, independent film and experimental filmmaking is better than ever. The status quo is constantly fluctuating. At the beginning of this video I mentioned how these characters become more than just people in a movie that we grew up with. As the years go on, we mythologize them, we look back in retrospect and see them as personifications of an ideology or a concept. They become larger than life. A character like Batman isn't remembered as a Bob Kane, Bill Finger creation. He's moved beyond that, and nobody can claim ownership of the character really because it means different things to different people. To some, he's a campy, colourful kids character, to others, he's a gritty, violent anti-hero. The most modern interpretation of the character is himself a deconstruction of what his impact on Gotham realistically amounts to, a deconstruction on how fans of the character perceive him, with the ultimate conclusion being a reinvention of the typical character arc you expect him to go on. Spider-Verse did the same with Peter B. Parker in the first movie and the meta-introduction of canon events in the second. Logan did the same with Wolverine. So much time has passed and they've been reinterpreted so many times that they become mythologized, meaning different things to different people. The same context applies to these legacy characters. Luke Skywalker after Return of the Jedi has come to personify a lot of different things: sacrifice, virtue, and the go-to archetype of the hero's journey. Star Wars as a franchise itself was built to be its own mythology, a series in a universe that would have a life outside of itself. So like a Batman or a Spider-Man, the past few years creatives have done just that. When I look at something like The Last Jedi, I don't see a product that was made in a cynical attempt to tear down the Star Wars franchise out of some kind of bitterness or resentment for the IP as a whole. I see a film made by somebody who views Star Wars the same way I do, as a personification of a variety of different themes, to use it as an avenue for deconstruction. Does that make it not bad? No, of course not. The Last Jedi is still pretty bad and ignores pivotal context for making a deconstruction work. Luke Skywalker being an old man who questions the Jedi Order of the past is something I believe could happen and is an interesting basis to explore what a character like that, or a mythos like that, really amounts to when we hold it up to scrutiny. Him almost murdering his nephew in cold blood after being established as someone who gave up everything to redeem his space Hitler dad? That's bad. You did a bad job, Rian Johnson. That is not how you handle a character like this. Luke isn't a Batman or a Spider-Man. You can't pick or choose what to keep and what to get rid of for what best suits your vision. These are someone else's character you've been given the keys to use and make work. That's what makes the handling of a legacy character bad. That's what a lot of these fail at doing, keeping it congruous with what we're familiar with, but having their legacy be questioned, challenged, and subverted is not in and of itself a bad trait, and is just a natural byproduct in bringing characters back that have been absent for years, either in universe or in our real world. There's immense value in giving us what we like and what we remember, bringing back our childhood toys in a way that's familiar, that doesn't deconstruct and instead earnestly carries on that childhood optimism. But broadly, from my own perspective, I think you need to have at least some aspect of that. Things change, people change, we change, and characters that were byproducts of their time shouldn't be exact carbon copies of how we remember them if they're going to be brought back. There's a degree of comfort for me in seeing that change, seeing something that's a remnant of a time I can barely connect with grow up with me. Their character's still intact but with new flaws, going on their own journeys that have tested them, challenged them, and changed them either for better or for worse. We're not kids anymore. If something is going to be brought back from the past for the purpose of weaponizing my nostalgia, it should never be so cynical. While in the moment I may enjoy seeing my favorite characters be brought back almost exactly how I remember them, being exactly who they were or what I always imagined them doing, it'll never fully sit right with me. All it will end up being is a passing, fleeting high, where all I get out of it is a brief hit of something I'll never be able to get back. Nostalgia is comforting, safe, and enjoyable, but in the end all it is latching onto the ghost of something you no longer have. They should change for the times, challenge my recollection, and make each reincarnation something I can tie to myself in the modern day, instead of a shell of the thing that reminds me of the ghost of my lost self. I'm Typoh, this has been my video, thank you for watching.